the August 4th, 2020 meeting of the Nantucket Memorial Airport Commission Energy and Environment Subcommittee meeting. Allow me to read the script for remotely conducted open meetings. The August 4th, 2020 meeting of the... Sorry, one second. Let me... we are live. And as a preliminary matter, this is Arthur Gasparo, Nantucket Airport Commission Vice Chairman. Permit me to confirm that all members and persons anticipated on the agenda are present and can hear me. Members, when I call your name, please respond in the affirmative. Mr. Buscarin? Here. And myself. And then we also have in attendance Commissioner Ms. Topham. Could you hear us?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. And staff, when I call your name, please respond in the affirmative. Mr. Carberg?
Here.
Mr. Rafter?
Here.
Massilia?
Here.
Thank you. And then anticipated speakers on the agenda, please respond in the affirmative. Mr. Lasden? Here. Mr. Fallon Johnson? Mr. Merrow?
Yes, here.
And I see that Airport Chair Mr. Drake has also joined us. Can you please respond in the affirmative that you could hear us?
I can, thank you.
And Ms. Perales?
Here.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon. This is an open meeting of the Environmental Subcommittee of the Nantucket Memorial Airport Commission, conducted remotely, consistent with Governor Baker's executive order of March 12, 2020, due to the state of emergency, the outbreak of COVID. In order to mitigate transmission of COVID, we've been advised and directed to suspend public gatherings, and such that governor's order suspends the requirement of the open meeting law to have all meetings publicly accessible physical location. Further, all members of public bodies are allowed and encouraged to participate remotely. The order, which you can find posted with the agenda materials for this meeting, allows public bodies to meet entirely remotely so long as reasonable public access is afforded, so that the public can follow along with deliberations of the meeting. Ensuring public access does not ensure public participation unless such participation is required law. This meeting will feature public comment. For this meeting, the Nantucket Memorial Airport Commission Environmental Subcommittee is convening by video conference via Zoom app and broadcasting on the Town of Nantucket YouTube channel. Please note this meeting is being recorded and that all attendees participating by video conference. Accordingly, please be aware that other folks may be able to see you, and take care not to screen share your computer, or anything that you broadcast may be captured by the recording. All supporting materials have been provided to the members of this body, are available on the town's website unless otherwise noticed. The public is encouraged to follow along using the posted agenda unless I note otherwise. Now turning to the first item on the agenda. Before we do so, permit me to cover some ground rules for effective, clear conduct of our business and to ensure accurate meeting minutes. I will introduce each speaker on the agenda. After they conclude their remarks, I will go down the line of members, inviting each by name to provide any comment, questions, or motions. Please hold your name until call. Further, please remember to mute your phone or computer when you are not speaking. Please remember to speak clearly in a way that helps generate accurate minutes. For any response, please wait until the chair yields the floor to you. State your name before speaking. If members wish to engage in conversation with other members, please do so through the chair, taking care to identify yourself. For items with public comment, after members have spoken, I will forward public comment as follows. We will activate the chat feature on YouTube, and members of the public who have comments or questions can use this feature to communicate with the public body. Instructions are on the town's website, and we will do our best ourselves, the staff, to address the questions or comment. Finally, each vote taken in this meeting will be conducted by roll call vote. Thank you. So we'll move to the first item on the agenda. So this meeting is being both audio and video recorded. We have an agenda for the meeting before us. Are there any questions or concerns regarding this agenda? Hearing none, consider this adopted by unanimous consent. And the next item on the agenda is discussion of the PFAS substances investigation and remediation. And we have draft task orders before us, starting with the Nobodere Way area. And I would like to turn it over to either Mr. Carberg or Mr. Lasden, whoever would like to give us a brief synopsis on this task order, please. Thank you.
So If I may, Mr. Gasparo, if you want to entertain it, I have a brief project update which might segue into the task order if you would like it.
That'd be great. Thank you.
Okay. So this information on our current activity is updated as of today. It's my understanding that Weston staff are out sampling on island today and performing other tasks. In the Matagasham Valley Road area, we have 19 of 22 total wells that have been sampled. 4 well results are pending. We believe those results should be in on or around August 7th. 3 of those wells were at non-detect. 4 were between non-detect and 20 parts per trillion. 3 were between 20 parts per trillion and 200 parts per trillion. 5 were greater than 200 parts per trillion. There are 3 outstanding wells that were not sampled. 1 of these wells is scheduled to be sampled in August. And we still have 2 outstanding residences that have been non-responsive to contact. On Matagasham Valley Road, we've installed a number of POET systems. I have these broken down by well concentration as well. In the 20 to 200 parts per trillion range, 3 POET systems have been installed. 3 POET systems are necessary. 1 has been installed and confirmed as functioning to non-detect, and 2 are pending installation. For the residences at greater than 200 parts per trillion, of which there are 5, all 5 have been installed. 3 are waiting for confirmation to no detection, with those results anticipated on or around August 7th. The remaining 2 have been installed and are or will be sampled today for confirmation to no detect. In the neighborhood west of the airport, 21 residences over 18 parcels have been sampled. We will have confirmation on the number of wells today. There's some disagreement between assessor data, homeowner recollection, and public health record about which properties are served by what wells, but we will get that lined up. 4 further residences over 3 parcels are being sampled today. 1 resident in that area has been unresponsive to contact. In what we're now calling the Novadear Way area, and we'll discuss a little bit later today, we have an area across from airport gas in the hangar area, which, although town water is available, we found out that some of these homes are not on town water. On the recommendation of our LSP, we've prioritized sampling of these homes. We've received access agreements for 3 out of 6 homes identified on Novadear Way, and those will be sampled or are being sampled today. And the 3 remaining homes have been non-responsive to contact so far, but I use non-responsive as we're very, very early in this process. We might have responsiveness today or in a couple of days. That concludes the update.
Thank you. Tony, any questions on the update?
No, I think it was all very clear. Thanks.
Thanks, Noel. I'm moving on to the scope for Novadear Way. It sounds like you've gotten started on that, but is there anything further that we should discuss on that?
I will say, Mr. Gasparo, that in discussion with the airport and council, we are looking into the ability to put a test well on airport gas property. So we are working with council and the airport staff in understanding what our agreement allows us to do on their leasehold property. And should we get to that point, we are planning on, in this scope, putting a test well on their property. They do not currently have any monitoring wells on their property, or their leasehold, I should say.
And does that fall under the task order for Novadear Way area, Plume identification?
Novadear Way. It was put in the Novadear Way task.
Okay. And what about, and maybe this falls under the next task order for Plume identification, would there also be a monitoring well put in the so-called Statue Park? test well area there?
So we will work with the LSP. As part of the task order, we have additional test wells to install. They have not been identified at this point where they will be. Part of the determination of those test wells will be a windshield survey of surrounding parcels of the land to understand the sort of the best place to put those based on historic use of properties around the airport.
Okay, so it does sound like that falls into the discussion that we'll have on the plume identification task order.
Correct.
So is there any further discussion on the Nobadir Way area task order?
I think Mr. Carberg did a good synopsis of where we are in that one.
And so Tony, I guess the question would be for us to discuss at a subcommittee level, is this something that we need to recommend to the commission, or is simply, brought forward under regular procedure? Which would seem to me, if we don't have any concerns with it, that it would just come up for the next commission meeting under pen and contracts and leases.
No, it appears to me that I think the staff is doing a great job in trying to define the plume or spread of PFAS, such as it would be. And I think these task orders adequately address the issue as far as I'm concerned. I think the last time we had such a meeting, we were there for about 2 hours, and I think we both agreed that it was extremely important from a policy point of view to define the plume as quickly as possible. And I think we're doing just that. And I really appreciate the good work by Mr. Carborg and Mr. Lasden in pursuing that. So I'm all set.
Okay, thank you. I agree. I think that it's nice to see us moving forward, so expeditiously and exactly as we had discussed at at our last meeting, the June 15th meeting, which has I think led to this, along with the in between commission meetings that we had. I did have a question related to the time frame on the second task order for the plume identification, which was included in the scope of services. So if we could, since I think we're okay with Nobadir Farm Way, could we transition to a brief overview of the plume identification scope and process?
Did you have a question, Dan? I saw you had your hand up.
You're muted.
I did, but maybe it's a little premature. Why don't you go ahead and go through this discussion, and then I'll ask it. Thank you.
So could we maybe do a quick overview of how the second task order is going to proceed with the plume identification and that process?
Absolutely. Is that okay? I will answer that. So as part of the task order, there is a series of items to help us identify the plume. There's some test pits that you do at the actual location of the release to determine if there's any material still at the release site. And then from there is essentially what's called a phase one, which you sort of understand what else and where it's been used. If by chance it's been used somewhere else that we know about, this would help us understand that. And then you sort of move out from there through discussions, as I said before, with this sort of windshield survey, understand sort of other influences that could have provided PFAS releases around the airport. And then you use that information to develop locations for installation of new wells. And you use some of that to help you identify the limits of the plume.
Thank you. So I know on, let's see, of our packet, it's page 13, and it's task 1 and then into task 3. And I'm just trying to understand the timeline where it says that the plan would be prepared by early 2021. So presumably 6 months from now or more. And then that the wells in task 3 would be installed of fall, over a year from now, or even 2022. And I'm sure there's some basis and reasoning for that. Can we go over why it's going to take so long?
There's some, as I said, there's some investigation to do ahead of time. It also, I guess, a little bit has to do with some direction, I guess, from the commission on when we want to, when does this task order want to be authorized to move forward, I guess, is part of that discussion. If we authorize it now, some of these dates can move up. And then we can look at better getting a handle on some of the events as they're listed.
My inclination would be to accelerate testing to the best of our ability to define the plume so that we can remediate any issues that arise. I think it's best to pursue this as soon as we can.
Mr. Rafter?
Yeah, I know very little about all this technical stuff, but I just have a question. If I understand the concern about identifying the plume, is it more critical to get the town water in there and then identify the plume, or do you do it the other way around? I don't know. In other words, if we get town water in, if that's the ultimate fix, is identifying the plume, and I guess it's going to depend on the results we get in the west side. I just don't know which one takes priority over the other, that's all.
Mr. Drake?
In the same vein, my question is it looks like the process of identifying the plume only relates to the MVR properties at the moment, those that are down gradient from the airport. Is that correct?
So as I indicated earlier, Mr. Drake, there will be a windshield survey and what's called a phase 1 to understand other upstream influencers. But
Well, I mean, this is basically what I'm getting at.
Yep.
I'm trying to understand if town water is going in,
yep,
and we presumably are in pretty good shape. We don't know that, won't know that for another few days. On the west side of the airport, what's the point of identifying the plume?
So identifying the plume is two things. We have an obligation to clean it or treat it in some fashion. And presumably if some of the plume was influenced by other sources, there could be some other responsible parties that could help the airport financially.
Well, I mean, I'm not a hydrologist or anything like that, but I mean, if we stopped putting this stuff out 2 years ago, surely there's some data on how long it takes to transfer through the system, if you will.
Yes.
And get down to the points where it's being found now.
Correct.
Do we have any information on how much longer that will continue, assuming it's just from for the moment, it's just from our discharge of the foam?
We haven't done any testing at the actual source of the release to indicate the concentration at the release point. So the question you're asking, I believe, is how fast will it dissipate over time? And we have data.
It's not going to dissipate, presumably, but how fast is it going to have moved out, essentially?
Correct. Yes, and we don't have the data at the actual release points yet.
Well, don't you need that before you start chasing after the plume?
Yeah, yes, and that's what I indicated before. We will be doing some excavation test pits at the actual release points to
Right.
help get us some of that information, and that's all part of this task.
But if that information basically came up clean, maybe I'm being totally naive, but if it came up clean saying that the PFAS had moved out of that area,
Yep.
how important at that point does it become to continue to track the plume?
I believe that the DEP would still want us to do some kind of remediation.
At the release sites or somewhere else?
Well, no, as it travels through the airport to mitigate it sort of downstream at our immediate end of our downstream property, they would want us to treat it before it leaves our property.
Before it goes in the ocean, basically.
Or
Because presumably,
migrates to the private homes south of
yeah,
us.
but those will be solved by the putting in of the wells or even the POET systems.
I will get back to you on an answer on that, but I don't believe that's the way the pollution laws work. I believe we have to clean up. Even though we've provided them with the water, we are still responsible to clean up the plume.
All right.
Yeah, my
I
experience.
just appreciate confirmation of that.
Yep.
Yeah, I think to protect our legal situation, I think it's best to be able to identify the plume. And of course, at the same time, if we could find other sources for PFAS besides the airport, that would certainly be useful to us. But I think in any of these governmental sites around the US, you're required to remediate the issue. Now, how we ever do that with PFAS with such minuscule amounts of material is a mystery to me. But I think our responsibility is going to be greater than just putting in the town water and saying we got the job done. I think that's absolutely important. But I think we do need to look beyond and to any remediation requirement that might be imposed on us.
Chairman?
Yeah, Mr. Rafter.
I agree with Commissioner Biscarin completely. And in fact, Hyannis related to us that I guess the final step that they're going through is they have to cap where they dispense the foam as well. So they're either paving it or whatever. So yeah, you have to go through the full remediation. My question was more in line of, I'm not saying we shouldn't do it. We don't have to do it. I think we're going to have to. I'm just looking at priorities. We were given an additional sum of money, and I don't know the numbers here for each of these tasks. And I just thought if we could prioritize them, you know, where's the money better spent right now before we go back and ask for another chunk?
So there were no costs associated at this point with these task orders, presumably because Mr. Lassen, please correct me if I'm wrong, this commit so that you could get the input from the subcommittee as to finalizing the task orders and then put the cost to them and bring them to the entire commission at our next meeting.
That is correct, Mr. Gasparo.
And to Mr. Rafter's point, I guess the discussion would be whether we discuss now which order we may want to put these in, or whether that decision really, and only as a recommendation to the commission, or if that's really going to have to be decided at a commission level with the numbers attached as well, which probably makes, you know, more sense. I think from a subcommittee point of view, it's trying to make sure that each task order appropriately encapsulates all of the work that we hope to get done, and then see how much it costs. And then under pending contracts, there would probably be a fairly intensive discussion at the commission level, whether they're all approved, or in with your input as well, Tom and Noah, as to, you know, which may go first, second, third.
Yeah,
But
I
I
would hope we'd have enough money to do all of it, but I'm not sure that's going to be the case.
that's probably a follow-up discussion as well. I think that, you know, in general, I would have presumed that the commission is going to have the financial aspect as a standing agenda item, you know, that we're going to have to track what's been spent and how we're going to continue to, you know, out of the allotment that's been put aside for this, where we stand and where we may be going.
Okay, so I don't want to take you off track. So we're here to better define, if you will, and make sure we're all on the same page for these tests.
I think so first, anyway.
Okay.
So I think on the, you know, my sense is that I agree with Mr. Buscarin in terms of just the timing on this included in the task order almost presents that we're going to put it off. And my preference would be to see that, you know, what would be the soonest dates that could be incorporated in this task order under a presumption of adoption at the next meeting. And then understanding that if the commission, for whatever reason, didn't adopt it or put it off or modified it, they could put them out. But I think it would be very helpful to have an understanding of how quickly this could be done from engagement.
I have a quick comment. I have a recommended priority. I think we're all looking a little bit to that issue. I think the first thing we need to do is define the plume. The second thing we need to do is to get in Wannacommon water into the area as quickly as possible, having defined the plume. And third, look at remediation issues as a third interest in priority.
That makes sense, but I think I'll get you one second, Mr. Drake. I think that could be influenced by the results we get at the end of this week as well, right? Because we may be saying we want to identify the plume, but if we find out that we have exceedances, along the airport, and we're faced with the same kind of orders from DEP for imminent hazards, and we have to take immediate action, then we may have to put those resources towards a decision related to water line extension or POET systems as well. So I don't know that we can, I agree with you in principle, but I think that, this is all moving fast and we really need to know what that next round, and we're so close, right? We should have that by the end of this week, and that would help, influence discussion at the very next commission meeting. Mr. Rafter.
Yeah, just a question. We talk about defining the plume, and I've heard a term elsewhere called fingerprinting, and that's kind of like doing the DNA. Is that part of defining the plume, or is that a separate task, or how does that work?
Thereafter, yeah, it's the fingerprinting is a CSI, watch TV. They can identify the manufacturer of the PFAS, which can help you identify if it was, quote, what you purchased or what someone else purchased and used. It is an early science. We can do that and that goes into our discussion of finding other potential responsible parties.
I just want to understand if it's in here, if it's being considered, or
it's not in here currently. It can be put in. It's just it's another sort of tool in a toolbox we can put in. Mr. Buscarin and Mr. Gasparo, if I could go back to your discussion on priorities, I will remind the committee that the water line installation, although there's an expense to it, once you put these people on town water, you eliminate some significant costs in monthly reporting and monitoring. You eliminate costs of POET installation and maintenance and upkeep. You eliminate some other costs by doing that. So longer term, you'll have other money or perhaps money unspent if you do the water line sooner.
Agreed.
Just a point of discussion.
Thank you. Mr. Drake.
With due respect, I'm still not convinced that the first priority is identifying the plume. But ultimately, I think whatever the commission decides are the priorities. Obviously, before they're cast in concrete, we want to run them by DEP, I presume, to make sure that they're in accord with what we're doing in order to make sure we aren't getting cross-legged with them. And I just think that it seems to me that getting the water line in is, after we take care of any immediate problems, getting the water line is certainly the first priority.
Mr. Carver?
Thank you. From a staff level, my immediate priority is still a separate task order to deal with the Nobody Way homes. We could also potentially approach it as an amendment to the task order the commission approved on 7/14. But I find just for tracking the project reservation of funds, it would be useful to go through that process of identifying the sampling requirements, the follow-up, hold potential costs for bottled water, POET, or water hookups, just for sake of efficiency. And I don't want to necessarily opine on water main versus plume identification, but a consideration for water main is that there is a fairly complicated permitting effort involved in that. Permitting feeds back into construction methodology, which feeds back into permitting, and it's a give and take. That the subcommittee or the full commission might want to at least consider some work for a design-only phase of the water line to get that work going. It might not have to be design and construction initially, because it does look like I don't want to call it a challenging permitting effort. The permit conditions are known, but there is some front work that I think has to happen related to that.
And Mr. Carver, you're referring to environmental permitting along the route of disturbance for the installation of the line primarily?
Correct. And in more detail, the early indications from MIPA and from MISA are that this is it's a standalone project, but they do take a very detailed look of where the limitations are for what is new disturbance versus existing disturbance. Even if it were, for example, to be trenched under Matacasham Valley Road, that still raises priority concerns with them. There's a certain level of support of engineered plans and documents that they've indicated they'd like to review. And I think Rich or Jed could speak in more detail to that.
Who's going to do the water line planning and who's going to pay for it? I think that's a key question. My understanding was that the town was going to front that expense, and then we would discuss reimbursement if necessary by the airport. Considering how our funds are sequenced, it might be best to go for the quickest installation of that water line. Just a quick comment on NOAA's situation. I think, the EPA should understand this is something of an exigent circumstance to create a public health, to remediate a public health problem. And I think that ought to overrule, concerns of a lesser nature. So that's just my view.
Unfortunately, that's not the case. To Commissioner Buscarin's point, the DOR has a threshold for emergency. MISA has a threshold for emergency, and DEP has a threshold for emergency, and they're not the same threshold. MISA staff have reviewed the project and said the provision of POETs meets the immediate concern. We do not believe this would be eligible for an emergency waiver.
Of course, the POET system is expensive and not a good final resolution. I think Mr. Lasden made that very clear, and I think Dan Drake and Tom Rafter all agree that the installation of Wanacommet water is an exigent circumstance for us here. We really need to get that done.
Mr. Chairman, I just want to confirm, Rich, assuming adequate funding, the definition of the plume and the water line design, permitting, and all that can move concurrently, correct?
They can. I just, as I indicated before, there's continuing money to support all those houses on POET systems that we just all have to recognize.
No, that's what I'm saying. Before we can put the line in, it's going to have to be designed and bid and permitted.
Correct.
And along the lines I think Noah mentioned, again, depending upon where we are with funding, we should be able to get design done, get that started, get the plume work going, and then if there's a big chunk needed, again, we go back and ask for it for the construction. And Mr. Buscarin, to your point, it's basically been discussed that we have to pay for the line, and we're the ones putting it out to bid.
Good. Well, then I think we should do a task order to get that designed, get Wanacommet water down that way as soon as we find out where we need it. Having already heard some information, I think Arthur Gasparo suggested that they're going to need to run the line down the west side of the airport all the way around along Matacasham Valley Road and back up as sort of a loop. And so if that's the general design concern, I think we might move along as quickly as possible with the task order to do just that.
So Mr. Lasden and Noah and the water company and a team of people from MJ were in the field yesterday, walking off exactly where it would go and how it would be run and everything else. So they're making good progress in that area.
That's great to hear. I mean, sometimes the answers are in the field. And so I'm glad to hear that, we're working on that route. On page 2, it's page 3 of our packet, but page 2 of the task order, task number 2, I believe does cover the design of this line with an understanding that there are some uncertainties as to what the final scope will be. And it sounds like, as it said in this, based on yesterday's site visit. So I presume that this may get refined and brought to the commission at our next meeting so that the design of the line and a potential route will be better understood. And that would be further, refined, presumably based upon the test results received this week, also in advance of the next commission meeting, which I think is all great. I think it's all working right along as quickly as could possibly be. I just hope that we would be able to have this task order, in a format that could be approved or certainly considered and discussed at the next commission meeting. That includes, as it does now, the water line, design. And I think that's everyone's point that's been made here. And I think we'll have decided on priorities, perhaps out of all of these, as the entire commission, when there's numbers associated with it, and we know whether or not we actually could potentially, just take it all on and work through all of it concurrently. And to Mr. Lasden's point, as I think we've previously discussed, if we could head off the installation of any additional POET systems by moving quickly on connections, and that may go to some of them may be more straightforward, such as the Nobodere area where a water line may exist and it may be connections versus water main extension. If we could be ready to perhaps do that instead of, anything that heads off a POET system with the maintenance costs associated with that, even if it's a greater initial capital cost, I think is a good decision. Mr. Drake, you're muted.
There's one other issue here which we all need to keep in mind, which is that this is all on top of what our not fat staff has to do to keep the airport running. And managing all these projects is a real juggling act. And so I would also look to Mr. Rafter for some guidance for the commission as to what really is doable and what may be beyond reach, particularly as to trying to do all these things at once.
In August.
I think these tasks, Dan, are less labor intensive for us than they are for certainly the consultant. And Noah, I don't want to speak for you because he's been spending probably 100% of his time on this. It's dealing with the individual homeowners and things that is time consuming. So the sooner we get that water line in, the better off everybody's going to be, I think.
So it sounds to me that there's general agreement on bringing forth the task orders as outlined, and then the commission, there should be, I think, costs associated with each of the scopes in case the commission needs to make decisions along with staff input as to, prioritizing because of the funding. Mr. Drake? You're muted.
If I may, through you, ask Mr. Laskin,
Of course.
is it possible to get reasonably accurate cost numbers on these by the commission meeting next week?
The commission meeting is next Tuesday,
Yes.
so you'd need finalized scopes by this Thursday?
No, we've got more latitude than that.
I think so.
Okay.
I mean, if we put the scope, the outline of the task orders in the meeting packet, I think we can refine them after that.
Okay, yes, we can do that. And it's going to be, if I can, Mr. Drake, it's going to be Nobadir Way, the water line, and plume identification are the 3 task orders you're looking for.
Correct. I mean, the others are pretty much taken care of, right? The bottled water, the poets.
In the current task order, we have a lot of that stuff through the next year.
Yeah, okay.
And that's a good, if I may, Mr. Drake, I believe in the emergency declaration, there was funding to finalize our original task order, which, if you remember, was only approved for sort of half the value. I don't know what the mechanism is to fund that completely.
That's a good question. I guess we better revisit it too at the next week's meeting,
I,
just to be certain, so that there's absolute clarity.
Yeah, because our task order was a not to exceed for approximately half the value.
That's right.
Mr.
Thank you
Rafter?
for that.
yeah, Noah, did you check with Brian Turbot on that? I thought we were good to go and they were going to sign off on the entire task order.
We're good on the entirety of the task order 1 as budgeted. I believe it was 936,000 plus an additional amount that we held for self-funding installation of poet systems.
So Rich, we'll have to get you the whatever paperwork, I guess, but yeah, we're good to go up to the 900 and some thousands.
Yeah, we'll have to rewrite the task order authorization, I guess, because currently it says 510 on the task order authorization. So if that's
Okay.
something that I have to do with you, we can do that.
Mr. Drake?
Just to be sure, let's redo it for next week.
Right, put it on the pending contracts
Yeah,
with the update, and then it's clean, I think, right?
right.
And then, so the only change that I had asked, I was hoping, and you could tell me whether it's possible, would be to look at advancing the dates.
Yes.
If, to what's reasonable. I understand you can't do this tomorrow, but, I think there could be a level of concern if the public sees dates involving 2022, for some of this work. And then I had a question related to Nobadir Way area, which was, has it been determined whether the property at the corner of Evergreen is at 1 Evergreen is on a well or town water right now?
I'll take.
Go ahead, Noah.
I know it's under investigation. I believe that the Weston has reached out to the homeowner who believes it's on a well, and that's part of their site visit today. And I believe that they will sample that today if it is.
Okay, great. So it's covered under the other contractor. This contractor is very good. Thank you.
Yeah. So just for a little more detail, we'll have an updated item on the website that will show the outline of those properties. We'll have that shortly, hopefully by the end of the day. We did give MJ notice to go ahead with the access agreements and sampling. At the end of the day, we're not sure whose responsibility this is going to be, but in the interest of public health and expediency, we're moving on that sampling. That's the reason why I had listed the Nobadir Way task order as my priority. Otherwise, we would have to probably amend the existing 714 task order. it's cleaner for staff purposes if nobody or way exists on an additional task order.
Does anybody else have anything further on the 3 PFAS task orders? Okay, so it sounds like that was a good discussion, and we'll look forward to the commission discussing them at the next meeting next Tuesday. The next item on the agenda was related to the South Apron expansion project, and including the footprint of the berm, of a potential berm in, as part of the environmental study. And we have a scope and effort to include that and add it to the EIR. And Mr. Lasner, Mr. Carver, could you give us a little overview of that?
If I may, I'd like to turn that over to Rich for either him or Jed to go through.
Not to play bouncing ball, I apologize. Jed, are you on?
Yes,
Would you
I
like to
am.
go- Okay, would you go over that, please?
Sure. So the interest from the Airport Commission was in a number of items, and I'm not sure how many of these you want to discuss, but a number of items related to South Apron, including possible air and noise and lighting effects of the South Apron and constructing a berm adjacent to it, looking at the footprint of the berm and incorporating the impacts of that into the environmental assessment, environmental impact report, and doing a cost-benefit analysis of the South Apron project. The scope we provided for this meeting pertains to adding the berm to the environmental assessment, environmental impact report. Would you like me to go through that scope, or what aspects of it would you like to discuss?
Yes, please. I see that really it is under item number 5. I think we should just briefly discuss, what you would be doing in terms of adding that in. And I'm trying to also understand that evaluating changes in, you said vegetation on greenhouse gas emissions, but does that also incorporate the use of the ramp?
So there's a number of possible impacts that the berm could have on the environment. And among those are rare species habitat, rare moth habitat, for example, in most of its shrub and forested area. Not all designated as priority habitat, but it is partly rare species habitat, and what isn't designated still could support those species. So natural heritage in particular, we'll be taking a close look at that. We'll need to look at what the changes in vegetation are, and as you mentioned, that pertains in a relatively minor way to the greenhouse gas analysis. There's several aspects of greenhouse gases that need to be looked at. One is building emissions, which is the crew quarters and the ground service equipment building. Another is construction activities. Another one is land alteration, where you're altering the vegetation. So for example, if you're cutting down a lot of trees, it could affect how much greenhouse gases are either absorbed by the vegetation or emitted by the vegetation. And the berm would alter the vegetation in the area, so it would need to be considered in that component, the land alteration component of the greenhouse gas analysis. Stormwater we need to look at. You wouldn't think there'd be any stormwater issue associated with the berm, but it does change the runoff rates, the runoff coefficient of the land being altered because we're steepening the slopes. So there might need to be some sort of incorporation of a small swale next to the berm to meet state stormwater requirements. I think those are the principal things that would need to be addressed in terms of the impacts of the berm. The berm was shown on the plans previously. It was shown in the environmental notification form, but we had only planned on looking at it from the perspective of cumulative effects, not really taking a detailed look at it. There's a little bit of design work that would need to be done to define the footprint of the berm better and the slopes, the stormwater limits of any stormwater management.
Thank you. And that would be covered under this task order, and then the EAIR associated site plan would have a limit of work that's been altered to incorporate the berm, which is ultimately, I think, the goal. So you would be looking at, some design, percent design of the berm in order to determine that limit of disturbance and work. And then, presumably the berm would be vegetated in some manner. So whether, that's kind of part of the design and helps to offset concerns, or perhaps even, get worked into a net benefit type of, a proposal, dependent on how that's approached, I think could be really positive. So it seems like with this, we would have, what we need. Now, the lighting portion of things, it seems to me that this scope that's before us is related to the lighting for the berm, but is there any scope that's associated with the lighting of the apron as part of the environmental assessment? Or will that just happen?
So
anyway?
that is the lighting and the air and noise effects of the berm are not included in this scope. They could be included. The air and noise is a trickier situation, which we can discuss in more detail if you'd like. The lighting is pretty straightforward. We did talk to our lighting people about this. They've done similar analysis on other projects, and what they would do is they do a generic lighting layout and light wattage and so forth. There's standard practices about what kinds of lights would be used and how much the light spreads. It's not a major effort to do that. There's a very small amount of design work and a modest amount of analysis. I mean, we could be talking maybe a few $1,000s more in terms of cost to this scope you see in front of you. So it would be some additional cost.
What is the cost of this scope? What is the total anticipated cost to investigate extension of the south ramp, including the berm, the EPA, cost of the concrete or tarmac? It seems to me like we're building very large costs here just to investigate this.
So if I may, Tony, just on the one scope that's before us related only to the berm, the cost that they've listed is $15,000. In terms of the costs associated with all of the EAIR, I deferred back to Mr. Lasden, but I seem to remember the contract was on the order of $500,000 for all the EAIR for all the CIP, but please correct me. Or
I don't remember offhand. I'd have to look it up. I will maybe in partial answering to Mr. Boscaron's question. The original EA document did include a sort of a high level look at emissions, light, and noise as a high level. It did not get into what's called a quantitative review. It looked at it from a qualitative review. If you remember, Mr. Gasparo, there was a separate noise study done for the airport that looked at ground handling and equipment movement on the ramps. So there was a noise study that was done with Mr. Carberg, we've had discussions with the FAA, and the things that we're doing here don't rise to the level, in their opinion, of paying for a quantitative review of these issues. The noise modeling system that's out there that the FAA uses, the FAA is interested in annualized average noise at airports, and that's how they determine across the country what noise issues are around airports. So they use an annualized average noise. And so the analysis they do gives that answer. It does not give specific ground service noise or aircraft APU noise. It doesn't get into that level of detail. The analysis that we did for you last year did do that. It went into that level of detail. So we have a pretty good noise model of what the noise on the South Apron would be based on a day in August or whatever the date was that was picked. So it would be a day that would probably be something of value to indicate how noisy it could be over there. As far as emissions, the emissions model that is out there utilizes the same FAA noise modeling system that we did not use. So in order to do emissions here, we would have to create that model in order to determine the emissions associated with the airport. But we'd have to build an entire model. We don't have any baseline data to start with.
I have a quick comment.
Yes.
I question the wisdom of extending a ramp area all the way down the south ramp as we're looking at.
Yes.
I think Noah Carberg did a quick cost-benefit analysis, and my understanding of that was that this is minimum $20 million to build it. Probably does not include the EPA issues, which are many and varied, nor the lighting, nor the noise problems, which could incur an inverse condemnation lawsuit by our neighbors there for the noise and smoke involved. And the recovery time for our $20 million investment appears to be 20 years plus. And I question, I think that was the best case scenario put forth by Noah. I don't mean to go after Noah with specificity, but I question the whole wisdom of even looking down this road. This looks to me like a big.
If I may,
and
Mr.
not much
Mascaron, I think the point that everybody has missed here is the reason we're doing this. Last year at our runway safety action team meeting with all FAA officials, the New England regional administrator was extremely dissatisfied and unhappy with us parking aircraft on the crosswind runway. And the airports people said the same thing. To follow that up in our CIP meeting, we were instructed to move this project ahead. We had it in the out years. We were told to move it up and advance it as fast as we can because of the safety concerns of us parking airplanes on a runway. They don't want that. They never want to see it. And it's a high risk thing. So we were instructed by the FAA to do this. 90% of the funding would come from them and 5% from the state. So in terms of our return, I think it's a safety issue. And we have experienced a number of ramp rashes in the past year here. So that's where this emanated from. We didn't just say, hey, we need more room, let's go build it. The FAA came to us and said, you got to get this and you got to get it soon.
So to that point, Mr. Drake?
Well, along those lines, when we did our last AIP as part of the master planning process a couple of years ago, my recollection, and correct me if I'm wrong, this matter came up and there was some discussion as to whether to include the berm in the AIP, and it was ultimately decided not to. because of the fact that none of the costs of this berm would be paid for by the FAA. And, you know, we were also looking at it then as some time down the road. But I think before we go very far with this, we need to get the commission to either bless or unbless this concept of you know, putting aside the whole issue of the ramp itself, of whether we want to and are in a position to spend whatever extra money it's going to take to do this on our own.
So in response to that, my recollection is that the ALP actually did get amended to include a noise barrier, and it was a type to be determined. So there is a noise barrier shown on the ALP. And I think that my recollection, we came to a point that supporting Mr. Rafter's position that for safety reason, the ramp expansion is a necessary item for the airport, but that at the same time, we would be willing to consider mitigation efforts, even if it meant we might have to pay some share of those. Because the other way we're looking at this is that they're just going to do that work, and it is going to, we've documented that through the noise study that there will be impacts. And we haven't documented, and that was kind of what I was trying to get at through the scope of the EIR, what other impacts there may be. And I'm not trying to be against the project. I'm trying to have the project as well as a level of mitigation to the impacts associated with the project.
I understand what you're saying. My only point is that I think at this juncture, with the landscape changing the way it has, the money we're going to have to spend on the unreimbursed money we're going to have to spend on the PFAS situation, that before this goes any further, the commission needs to take it under consideration.
Yeah, I mean, there's no doubt that this, you know, that this subcommittee is only going to make a recommendation to the commission, and that this task order will ultimately be decided there. And this task order would just take the footprint of the berm and study that as part of the EIR, which should be submitted, I think, in an effort to be efficient. Because if you were to do a standalone study later and additional permitting, it would just cost that much more. To your point, I get that a majority of the commission may not decide that they want to do any work associated with the mitigation, but my point is, I think that if we're going to build this, we do have a responsibility to try to, you know, mitigate impacts. And if it would help, and I see your hand, Mr. Rafter, I'll just give you 1 second. You know, I have the noise study open, and I'm going to share my screen just real quick, because the point I just want to make, you know, is that we have demonstrated, it has been demonstrated that there would be an increase in noise to neighboring properties associated with the, you know, with this expansion. And I think that if you have that, and you and you're going to have an impact, then we also have a responsibility to some extent to mitigate that impact. And how do we do that in the most cost efficient manner, which I think is including it with your current environmental permitting, is what I was trying to get at. Mr. Rafter.
So my understanding is that the South Apron is in the EIR, and we should, I think what we're trying to get here is we should include the berm in there so that if we go to do that project, we're not going back through permitting again. But as we get to the design level, we can certainly have input as to what it looks like, where it goes. The drawing you just showed had one layout of an apron, and I think we had been discussing a narrow strip, if you will, as opposed to the full depth. And we also, I think at one time discussed, you know, the dirt that's removed to put the apron down, we start to build the berm with. And we're also going to have a lot of dirt from Taxiway Echo too. So to offset some of that cost, we could probably, you know, get a lot of the berm out of the materials that we'll have on site. But I believe where you're trying to get to, Mr. Gasparo, was make sure it's in the EA/EIR so that we don't want to put forward in the EA/EIR projects that aren't fully complete or identified. And then as we get to the design and the specifics, we can get into, whether it's going to be a cost and if it's acceptable or not. And, we'll see how much the actual cost would be.
That was exactly my, Mr. Chairman, that was exactly my point, is that if we include the work that's in this task order, we'd have a place to dump that dirt, essentially, right? And that we had talked about a wall, as we looked at noise barriers, it does seem that this, even if it was potentially somewhat paid for by the airport, that this would probably be the most cost effective using hopefully materials that we have. And also, I think, aesthetically acceptable, if you will, versus, a highway type wall or something like that would, we'd have to shingle or, whatever. But I thought that was a good idea. So that was where I was trying to go with this. Mr. Buscarin?
How many days last year or in the past few years have we had to park aircraft on the alternate runway? I
This
thought
year-
this was a matter of a few weekends.
In the past it was, but they don't want 1 day, they don't want 1 hour. What happened, Tony, is we got to the point where initially we were just parking them during the day, but then it got so bad that we were leaving aircraft overnight out there. And that's where it really became a safety concern, because we were putting up lighted X's and the tower's closed, and if somebody lands on it, the what ifs and the risk assessment, they said, just was totally unacceptable. And again,
I well understand the safety issues. I appreciate that very much. Our alternative view is to raise our fees so that people who are parking over there, who show up in a $50 million jet, or even the poor folks in a $20 million jet, might be able to pay an extra $300 or $400 a night. We wouldn't have to extend the ramp down there. This could be, we could recover costs, not build the ramp, extend the ramp at all, and increase our costs and charges to accommodate the loss of aircraft that we would otherwise park on the other runway.
Mr. Carver?
If I may, I'm not trying to diminish that approach, but the danger in going that direction is pushing our corporate aviation operations from an overnight or 2 nights on the ramp to a quick turn, and doubling our operational account, which doubles noise impacts, doubles congestion, doubles emissions output. So it's I'm not trying to oversimplify it, but that argument does end up being a double-edged sword. I don't think the idea is that folks will come to Nantucket. I think for the operation company, which really ends up being the arbiter in most of this, they're going to look at doing a quick turn, going to Hyannis, RONing there, coming back, which only increases our operational counts and some of the negative impacts associated with that.
I feel like I would like to support a hybrid of where Mr. Buscarin and Mr. Rafter are coming from, which would be that, as well as Mr. Drake, that we need the funds to construct the mitigation that is the responsible thing to do if you're going to expand the ramp. So there would be a reasonable basis for some increase in rates and charges to generate funds to be used for the mitigation part that we have to cover for the expansion of that ramp. And I think that when we go back to the meetings that had been discussed as part of the airport layout plan and the CIP process, that there was I believe a commitment that, we would do expansion in a responsible way, and that we would, be open to mitigation. And I don't think that it's fair to the neighbors to say we're going to do the expansion, but we're not going to do the mitigation because that's not reimbursed. So I think that sooner rather than later, we figure out a way to start, knowing that the project's a couple of years out, if we could start recouping or building some of those funds through ramp charges, which is what's generating the need. So it's a direct cost center, and I believe would be justified. Then it's sort of it accomplishes both goals. So I appreciate the draft scope of services. Back to that point, does this scope include the plant surveys for the footprint of the berm, Mr. Merrill?
So it does not include plant surveys because we don't think plant surveys are going to be required. The berm occurs in the shrub and forested area that is habitat for rare moths, and the practice has been to assume that if that habitat exists, then the rare moths probably exist there, and they don't do surveys for rare moths usually. So there's no need to do rare plant surveys. The botanist has walked through the area, so he knows what the habitat is like, and we believe that that's sufficient. It's similar to the boatyard expansion and the Nobody crew quarters lots, those thickly vegetated areas where we were not required to do actual on-the-ground plant surveys.
Thank you. And based on that, would it, and this may be a step out that hasn't been fully considered, but would it be reasonable to revegetate the berm with similar type species? And given that you might actually have a greater amount of surface area by going up, over, and back down, that there actually could be a case to improve that habitat?
Yeah, it's certainly conceivable. It's not the first thing that comes to mind because it's such a different habitat structurally. When you think of sand barren grasslands, you think of large flat expanses. You don't think of berms. And also, I'm not sure the soils, I'm not sure you'd be able to get away with the sandy soils that you want for those kinds of habitats because the sandy soil is more erodible and you got it on a slope. It's certainly not out of the question. It's something that bears consideration. There might be some species that we could mitigate in that habitat, but it's definitely not a slam dunk. It's something that will have to be looked into.
Mr. Buscarin?
If we're going to do a task order to determine the viability and cost of extending the ramp as in our plans, I'd like to know the entire one task order, which is going to tell us how much money this whole thing is going to cost. So rather than doing it piecemeal, which seems to be where we're headed, I'd rather have one task order, find out what's this bread box going to cost us. And I'd like to know that now rather than 4 or 5 years from now. That's all.
If I may, and so Scott, I think we've already approved that as basically the task order for all of the projects, and that this is somewhat of an addendum to that because it wasn't included.
I believe that's correct.
That's for the EA. Tony, are you looking for the total cost of the South Apron?
Yeah. In other words, if
That's
the
right.
commission's going to decide to do this, we'd like to know what's it going to cost and how long is it going to take to recover that cost.
So if I may, Mr. Gasparo, that you might be getting to the cost benefit analysis that came up in conversations recently.
Mm-hmm. Go ahead, Mr. Merrill.
Yeah, so Rich and I had some conversations with our people who do this kind of work, the cost benefit analysis, and they came up with some scope items and hours that might be required. I think it was 112 hours of time, and we could send those tasks along if the commission wanted to see them. But I believe, and Rich, correct me if I'm wrong, I believe that was looking at the cost benefit of the South Apron itself, the South Apron expansion itself of that whole project. Is that correct?
Yes, the South Apron in and of itself, and as Mr. Carberg indicated before, the cost benefit is really the loss of people not parking at the airport, because they're parking today and on the runway, and presumably they park in the future on the South Apron expansion. So if they don't park on the South Apron expansion, that's the discussion. It's them parking on the apron or not, is the cost benefit.
Along with the design and construction.
Correct.
And so forth.
Correct.
Mr. Rafter?
If I can, for Mr. Biscarin, in a prior CIP, and we're currently updating our CIP, design and construction of South Apron Phase 1 and 2, total project cost was 5.7 million. FAA entitlement 1.4, discretionary 3.7, MassDOT 288,000, and the airport 288,000. And again, we're going to be revising this and updating it, but that's probably going to be close, I would say. So $5.7 million project, the airport would put up 288,450.
That sounds a lot better than 20 million, which was a figure that I was using. Of course, given our past experience with this type of project, the costs always seem to expand.
Well,
And I'm wondering what the
was
benefits would be.
Phase 1 and 2, 3 and 4 was another $6 million. But again, I see no reason to build the entire thing. The master plan showed a big honking apron out there at full depth, and we don't need that. We need a handful of parking positions.
So
Yeah,
go ahead, Mr. Biscarin.
my general view is that we're buying ourselves a whole lot of problems by doing the full extension. I certainly would be much more interested in doing something smaller along the lines that Mr. Rafter suggested.
So I think, agreed, and I think at this point, the discussion is really related to making sure that the environmental studies are done for the whole area. And then we would decide based on funding, but it seems that from what Mr. Rafter just told us, it would be a phase 1 and a phase 2. And I think that we had that, great presentation 2 commission meetings ago that had the ramp expansion, though I can't recall, and maybe Mr. Lassen, you can refresh my memory if it showed the entire all phases of the ramp, or was it just phases 1 and 2?
It was just what Mr. Rafter indicated we needed at this point. We decided to not do the rest of it.
So yeah, thank you. I think that, there we've already backed off to that, but the environmental study would, and, because we can't have project segmentation, we're in the middle of this permitting process. It would, at least for our first run, if I'm understanding it, for the submission, knowing there'll be feedback from the regulatory authorities that may have some influence on what's ultimately approved and decided, but we would start off with the whole thing for the study. If is that correct, Mr. Laston?
No, the study is only for what we need at this point.
Oh, thank you. Okay,
Yes.
so
Yeah, it's been reduced and significantly in size from what the original ALP showed.
That's better.
So I do hope that at the commission level, in which we can discuss, that there would be support for this task order so that it gets included. And then the other scope, it seems that, I'm not sure how we're going to get to that. It does seem to me not related to the cost benefit, but to the impacts related to lighting and emissions of the ramp itself, not the berm. That hasn't been addressed, and I've heard what you've said. I don't want to go in circles about that of whether that would be funded or not. But I thought that in our last meeting that was what we were going to look at, and I think that, as I see your hand, Mr. Rafter, let me finish real quick, and that as part of a design for a ramp, I would think we would have a lighting plan, and I think that hopefully the lights associated with this ramp would be of better shielding and better design, newer, I should say, than better from, the last time the airport did this. Because I think that it's hard to look at an environmental assessment without considering that level of lighting. And we're talking about moths, an impact on moths by taking out some scrub oak, but we're not talking about impacts on them from blazing the whole sky. So I guess I'm missing a piece of that there.
So if I may, just on the lighting, the complaints that we've received, at least when I first got here on lighting, was from Mattoxam Valley Road. So it really had nothing to do with lighting on the west side behind, let's say, where the berm is. And it was pretty interesting because I went out there and observed it one night with the neighbors, and it was pretty bright from the ramp. But yet when you got on the ramp, I couldn't see the back row of airplanes. I think you're right. It's a combination of, how high a mast we can get, what type of lighting we can get. But I just wanted everybody to be on the same page in terms of where the impacts of the lighting are. We've had no issues on the western Monahans side. It's been more, coming from Mattoxam Valley Road.
And what I'd like to head off is that this expansion goes right behind those houses. And then you do start getting those complaints, and it's as a result of an expansion project. So, or that there may be those concerns raised from some of those neighbors, and we would have answers in advance if we've started to look at and understanding that maybe some additional cost, but again, all going towards, a responsible expansion, a needed expansion, but in a responsible manner. And the other point that we've discussed was in terms of emissions and policies, such as the tow in, tow out, or how that might work. And as part of the environmental permitting, my hope would be to see that, to the extent possible, perhaps codified in some manner, to have policies that are established and reviewed by your environmental permitting process, so they're not just maybe this and maybe that, that they're more definitive to the extent that we can, is where I was trying to get at with this.
Mr. Gasparo, if I can. So a couple of questions. As indicated before, we think we have a noise model that's going to give us all the information we have. So part of this discussion here was to get a feel for the committee to see if we need to do another noise model, or can we just use the noise we have, the information from the previous study. And then, as I hopefully indicated before, in order to do an emissions analysis, we would have to build a model. There is no current model available, so we would have to build the model to analyze the air.
So I could say that understanding, especially all of the pressures on funding right now with the other environmental issues, that my position, and Tony perhaps is the same or different, but that we could use the model that was developed and that money was spent, has already been spent. And I think it shows that there is an impact and that it supports a position for some mitigation. And in terms of emissions, would we instead be able to put those funds or some funds and some effort into assuming that there would be increase in emissions? So we would, instead of doing the study, develop some policies and procedures that simply may help to mitigate that. Or do you feel that you only could support that if you did a study, I guess is the question. And what does that really entail? And,
I guess if I may, Jed, I'll ask you, what's your thoughts on some kind of a better qualitative emission study?
Well, I think we've done the better study in terms of what is the noise going to be on a...
No, for emissions, I'm sorry.
Emission?
Emissions, yeah.
Okay. So the model that's used for air quality emissions is the same as that is used for noise in terms of determining impacts from the federal perspective. And we don't really have any air quality information from the ramp expansion, and we're not planning to get it because we don't believe there's any potential for significant impacts from air quality. That's why the FAA is not requiring us to do it. That's why they wouldn't fund it. Getting better air quality results would require running this AEDT model, which is what's also used for the FAA noise studies, which is a fairly complex model that requires a lot of effort to put together and to run. And it's very likely we wouldn't come out with any impacts on the other end. We wouldn't find any exceedances of air quality criteria, is what we're thinking. It could be done, but it would be fairly expensive exercise, and we don't think it would give you the results that you're looking for.
Thank you, Mr. Buscarin.
Yeah, I don't think we need the noise study based on that.
Right. I think the noise study that we have, we can use to support the berm because we showed, that study showed an impact and it showed a reduction with the use of the berm, which I think supports an airport position from environmental permitting of including that footprint and justifying those impacts, which needs to be done for natural heritage for sure. Why that has to happen. I guess the other question is just back to the elephant in the room, is that we have so much going on at the moment with the pollutant of emerging concern and that situation. Where do we go with all of our environmental permitting related to the CIP? And we're covered for a taxiway echo, I believe, already. So that was our main concern. And should this ultimately just be, I don't want to see it put off indefinitely, but like just a couple of more months, and while you guys focus on all of the other things in front of you, I mean, is that a good recommendation? And would you support that, Tom? Noah?
I want to take a look at how it may impact the grant schedule and what projects are in the hopper, but we're going to be busy for the next few years here, so I'm not sure that it's a big issue to do that. I don't see a problem with it.
Okay, well, I wanted to hear that from you because I don't want to create the problems. And would I be correct in that you would support this task order that's before us for the inclusion of the footprint for this study that they've put forth?
Yeah, I think the footprint's no problem. And again, I think it should be put in there so that when we do go to build it, we have something already, in front of them. But as Jed said, the noise and emissions is a major tool that's really not going to give us what we want.
Okay.
It's going to be all annualized. But I also agree strongly with you that through policy and procedures, we can do a qualitative improvement, if we're going to expand down there.
Thank you. So I think if you agree, Mr. Buscarin, then the task order before us would simply be brought forth for the commission consideration next Tuesday, which is the $15,000. And that's essentially an addendum to the current environmental task order for all of the CIP projects. Did I misstate that, Mr. Carberg?
No, that is correct. And I'd like to reinforce what Tom said. Since this task would be parallel to the work MJ is already performing, you're never going to have a cheaper time to address this work. It's always better from a standpoint to have the permitting work started in advance. It doesn't mean that the project has to happen if there are unforeseeable circumstances, but it's good to get it done. And I think it's appropriate, and it's not, this alone isn't a heavy lift for staff. I'd also encourage that if it does go forward, it goes forward at the August commission meeting, so it can not affect other project permitting timelines.
Thank you.
Okay, I'll support that, Arthur.
Thank you. Mr. Drake, did you have anything you wanted to add to this?
No, I think that we'll talk about it next week.
Okay. So moving on to miscellaneous items on the agenda, Noah and I attended the NHESP Technical Advisory meeting, 2 weeks ago, maybe. Mr. Carver, do you want to give a brief update on that?
Yes, thank you. So Arthur and I attended the TAC meeting. The TAC is an annual meeting where we review the permit attainments for our ecological permitting. And we are the second or third largest landowner on island. We own a lot of resource issues that contribute to a well of biodiversity for the island and region. So this meeting reviews the land that we have, the management that we accomplished, and the management we hope to accomplish within the next year. It's a tract by tract, detailed technical review of what we're going to manage and how. For our standpoint, the majority of it focuses on different management regimes, down to the equipment, the timing, and the percent cover of scrub oak that we leave on the airfield. This new sort of paradigm shift has been very successful for the airport. We've been able to manage large portions inside the fence that have previously been inaccessible to rescue vehicles, that have been hazardous areas that contributed to the loafing of wildlife. And we've done so in a manner that has also increased the habitat quality for rare species. So I think this is one of the, rare celebratory win-win-wins that we get to bring to your attention.
Yeah, I thought that I thought you did a great job with the presentation, and the photos were very helpful. For the Zoom format, and the mowing, and I think that a lot has been accomplished there. I guess we didn't bring up too much, other than I just tried to very lightly hit on that. We're now facing the PFAS issue, and that was going to be something that would have some impact on how we proceed in the near future in terms of what we might have to come forward with. And I think that is important that they're going to be aware of that, or probably are already, if you're having discussions about the water line route. And we look forward to see that water line route may change rather significantly based on the results on the west side. So we'll have to wait and see on that, I think. Anyone else on the TAC meeting? Questions, comments? And then we had update for the stormwater study.
Yes, so the stormwater inventory and assessment project is underway. We coordinated field work with Jacobs, our other on-call engineer, for last week or the week before. The coordination, we're looking to identify and inventory all of our stormwater collection systems, identify where they are, what condition they're in, what maintenance steps need to be scheduled for them, and better coordinate their inventory through a GIS database instead of PDF charts across multiple documents. So Jacobs began this work. They benchmarked the known structures. They created a GIS portal to load their field data. They performed a site survey from the 29th to the 31st, and they're doing an in-house review of this data now. Over the next few weeks, they're going to extract this data, create the report, consolidate it into a deliverable for us with a narrative portion related to the maintenance and upkeep of the stormwater infrastructure. Preliminary figure they've provided to us indicates the ground truth location of all of these historical catch basin systems along the airport property, with an initial indication as to their structural integrity. The good news is we have a lot of green, and most of the airfield is in green, green being good. Yellow, orange, and red dots, not so good. We have a few of those on Bunker Road and one on the ramp area, and only 3 structures that we couldn't verify. I think that will require another field visit, but we're well on our way. I have this data. Arthur, I can share it with you. I believe you might be interested in the progress now. Yeah, that's it. It was a good set of field work. Mackenzie showed up from Jacobs. He was able to accommodate a lot of this work independently, and then escorted by airport ops for the airfield component. And it was done safely, so it's another plus.
That's great. I think that this was a really important project for environmental stewardship for the airport, you know, and then I think that once we have this, we can discuss development of best management practices and, you know, methods for, you know, ongoing operations and maintenance. And perhaps if there's some additional equipment that's needed, then get that in line for some funding if needed, and, you know, sort of work towards that as next steps, I hope. Thank you. Anyone else have questions on the stormwater? No. So I believe that concludes the meeting for today, unless anyone has anything else they wanted to add. Mr. Merrill, you're muted.
Quick question. Should we turn the scope that we created for the berm footprint into a task order?
I would like to see that for the commission meeting in August, which I believe was supported by Mr. Rafter, Mr. Carver, Mr. Buscarin, though
Okay.
certainly there'll be some discussion at the commission level.
You should include the berm into the task order too. We'd like to see what that cost might be.
Well, the task order would just be for studying the
The
footprint of the berm, its impacts. We'll be designing a berm, but and I guess typically we do have a rough cost estimate for projects, construction cost estimate.
Yeah, I'd be very interested to see what that would cost.
But the task order will not be for design.
I understand.
Not, you know, not detailed design.
Understand.
Thank you. Anyone have anything else for today? Hearing none, I guess we have to do a roll call to adjourn a subcommittee meeting for two of us. Mr. Buscarin, how do you vote?
Let's adjourn.
All right, I'll adjourn as well. Thank you, everybody. Appreciate all the efforts. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Arthur.